In this video, I'll be performing some leather seat repair and restoration work on the interior of a Porsche 944 to include restitching some broken threads along the seams and recoloring some faded sections on the seat bolsters. The interior of this car is actually in pretty good shape considering the car's age and mileage, but there are a few areas on the leather seat covers that could use some attention. If not properly cared for, leather seats will eventually dry out, harden, and shrink due to sunlight exposure, and leather that doesn't experience regular use isn't afforded the same opportunity to naturally stretch and break in. So what you'll often see with these cars is that the leather on the passenger seat is generally firmer and tighter, and because of the shrinkage, the seam threads have the tendency to break. The leather on the driver's seat is often softer, but here you'll see fading and discoloration along the seat bolsters from repetitive use. So let's get into the repair and see how we can refresh these seats a bit. In order to care for these items, you'll need some replacement thread to match the interior color of your car and some heavy-duty hand sewing needles. Because of its overall strength and elasticity, nylon thread is a good choice for automotive upholstery. It's also important to pair the right thread size with the thickness of the material being used. Thread sizes of Tex 90, 135, or 210 are commonly used for car interiors. There are some thinner nylon threads available that would be strong enough to hold this application, but something like this is so thin that it could end up cutting through the leather as the material is stretched with use. So I've got some T90 nylon thread that matches well with the original thread size used for these seats. For the faded areas on the seat bolsters, I've got a leather recoloring kit from Leather World Technologies that includes color prep and cleaner, a dye colorant, and a protective cream, which is everything you'll need to properly prep, recolor, and protect the leather. It also includes all the necessary application tools and detailed instructions. This professional grade kit did cost about $60 for just a small quantity of dye, but you want to be careful with some of the cheaper alternatives on the market as they're more of a paint or a rubberized patch than a true dye, which could produce less than desirable results. With all the supplies in order, I'm going to start with the seam repair, and in order to restitch the seam, we'll need to remove the cover from the lower seat cushion, which means the seat will need to come out of the car. The seat rails are secured by 6mm hex head bolts, 2 in the front and 4 in the rear. So go ahead and remove all the bolts from the seat rails. And with the bolts removed, you can tilt the seat backward a bit and disconnect any electrical connectors for the seatbelt sensor and power seat motors as applicable, depending on the interior options for your car. And now that everything is disconnected, the seat can be removed from the car. Next, I'll be removing the seat back so that it's a little easier to work on the seat bottom cushion. To do so, first remove the plastic hinge covers on each side of the seat back with a Phillips head screwdriver. With the covers removed, the mounting bolts and cable connection points for the seat tilt lever are revealed, and you can see the original seats were manufactured by Recaro. At this point, the C-clips can be removed using pliers or a screwdriver, and the cable cams pulled away from the spline shafts on each side, and finally, the two 15mm bolts can be removed from each side of the seat back, and the seat back can be lifted straight off of the assembly. Now that the seat assembly is removed from the car and broken down, you can turn it over and begin removing the seat cover. Along the perimeter, you'll see that the seat cover is secured with some metal rings and pointed tabs spaced approximately 3 inches apart. The rings can be cut off with a good pair of diagonal cutters or loosened and removed using a pair of pliers. To replace the rings, you'll need to pick up some hog rings or metal upholstery clips to secure the cover upon reassembly. The pointed tabs attached to the front and sides of the seat frame can be gently bent outwards to release the fabric, so just work your way around until all the perimeter clips are loosened or removed, and then check for any rings along the inside foam areas that hold the left and right seams to the spring foundation. If you're working on a power seat, you may have to remove portions of the mechanism to gain further access. You'll also need to unbolt and remove the seat rails and adjustment handle to free up the fabric. The seat rail is secured to the frame by 7 hex head bolts, and you can use the adjustment handle to move the rails forward and back to expose the opposing bolts. With all the clips and hardware removed, the seat cover can be pulled away from the seat frame and the foam cushion. For any hand-sewn leather work, you'll generally want to start with a length of thread that provides enough room and flexibility to easily complete the stitch. For this small section, I'm just going to cut about 3 feet of thread. We won't need to mark the stitch holes or spacing since we're simply resewing a previously created seam, which allows the original thread holes to be used. There are a few different stitch types you could use to get the job done here, but I'm just going to replicate the straight stitch that would have been originally machined into the leather. To complete the straight stitch, we'll need a length of thread tied off on a curved repair needle. And we'll start by passing the needle and thread through one of the holes in an area of the seam that's still fully intact, pulling the thread about halfway through. We'll then move back one hole and pass the needle and thread through a second time. And finally pass the needle back through the original first hole and pull it tight, creating a nice loop to lock down the thread. From here, we can pass the other end of the thread through the eye of a sewing needle, and we'll push that needle and thread through each subsequent hole in the leather material, feeding the curved needle through the backside of the thread each time it's pushed through, then pull the straight needle back out and tighten the thread. Repeat this process until the entire split section of the seam is repaired, and when you reach the other side, we can pass one side of the thread completely through the material so that both ends of the thread are on the same side of the material. Remove the needles, and tie off the threads with a few basic square knots to complete the stitch. That completes one side of the repair, but you can see on the other side there is a small tear in the leather to care for. So what I'm going to do is flatten it out and glue down a strip of nylon to create a new backing for the leather. You can use a small piece of canvas or denim as well, any material that is relatively thin but also strong and flexible, and I'm going to use some leather glue to adhere the materials together. This glue will provide good holding power on textured surfaces, but also dries with some flexibility to it. Other options here would include upholstery adhesive or similar alternatives, and after the glue cures for about 24 hours, the tear will be repaired with some new backing material, and then the same stitch pattern can be applied to bring the seam back together. With the seat cover repaired, it can now be reinstalled onto the bottom seat cushion in the reverse order of removal. Start with the front, working side to side and front to rear to stretch and position the leather. Once it's in a centered position, begin resecuring the pointed tabs from front to rear, saving the rear for last in order to pull everything tightly together with some hog rings. Resecure the seamed material to the metal foundation using additional hog rings, which are simply pinched closed with a pair of pliers or a hog ring tool. There are some metal rods that run through the fabric for the center seams, and that's where you'll want to clamp the rings to the spring foundation. When it's all tightened down, you can install the seat rails, adjustment handles, and power mechanisms as applicable, and then you can begin to reattach the seat back to the lower frame using the 15mm mounting bolts. To reinstall the cable cams for the seat levers, first thread the cable ends through the cams and then install the cams onto the spline shafts. For proper adjustment, the cable slack should be removed while the seat tilt lever is in the lowest position while installing each cam, and with the cams in place, the C-clips can be reinstalled, and finally the plastic hinge covers. At this point, you can move the seat assembly back to the car, reconnect any electrical connectors, and install the 6mm mounting bolts onto the seat rails. The leather repair work on the passenger seat turned out pretty well, so it's time to move on to the recoloring process for some of the faded areas on the driver's seat. Here, you'll want to closely follow the instructions for whatever product you decide to use, but for this kit involves prepping and cleaning the surface of the leather, applying the color dye, and applying the protection cream. To get started, I'm going to spray the color prep and cleaner to all the areas that are going to be recolored. Then, using the enclosed scuff pad, scuff the leather to prepare it to accept the dye colorant, applying only light pressure here so as not to scratch the leather surface, and finally wipe the areas clean and allow the leather to dry before moving on to the next step. For the dyeing application, this kit was color matched to Porsche Black, but it's a good idea to first test the color in an inconspicuous area before you start dyeing large sections just to make sure the color is true. The dye colorant can be applied by spraying it on the surface or using the enclosed sponge. Make sure all the adjoining areas are cleaned around the outer edges of the repair area, and then apply light coats to the leather surface. It may take between 2 to 4 coats of the leather dye to fully achieve the desired color effect and to provide maximum durability. You'll also want to allow 4 to 6 hours of dry time between coats and 24 hours of drying time after the final coat before use. A hair dryer can be used to speed up the drying time as needed, and if the area is not completely smooth, you can lightly sand the leather using 600 to 1000 grit sandpaper before applying the next coat of dye colorant. Once the desired color is achieved, wait 24 to 48 hours before applying a light coating of the leather protection cream, and this will provide the leather with added durability and protection against general soiling. Well, this leather repair and restoration work turned out pretty well and really helped refresh the overall look of the interior. The seats are now cleaner and the leather surface is softer and smoother overall, so I'll just continue to periodically treat the leather with protectant to preserve the condition.